Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Talk Math with your friends. Our speaker today is Dr. Priyam Patel. Dr. Patel is an assistant professor at the University of Utah, and today she'll be talking about finding research projects and collaborators. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Patel.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and try to make my computer do good things. Okay. If at any point you can't, you know what, actually, let me just move this first. If you can't like see something or if something seems wrong, just let me know. You can unmute yourself and interject at any point in time for the entire audience. I don't mind. I would prefer that actually. So, okay. So, my name is Priyam. I am an assistant professor at the University of Utah, as you already heard. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm just gonna give some tips today about finding research projects and collaborators. So the first third will be some general tips. Then I'll talk about some things that have helped me. And then I'll open the floor to the audience. If you all have any ideas, I can accumulate them on the last slide in this presentation. So I chose this like very relaxing pottery background because that's like the vibe I needed today. So yeah, I just put this together just because it's nice and pretty. So I'll say a lot more about each bullet point, but I'm just summarizing things now. So here's the first general tip on how to figure out like how to find research projects and collaborators. So I was told this a long time ago, but subscribe to the archive digest in your area and in some neighboring areas. I feel like for me, that's the best way that I have figured out what's popular at a given moment in time, even if it's not directly in my field, then I know things about adjacent fields. Like if I keep seeing like Heegard Fleur come up, well, I know that that's like something important, right? So, you can just get an email to your inbox every day with the 3 or 4, maybe just one subject area that you're interested in just learning a little bit about. So usually the way I deal with this is I trash the email like when I'm too overwhelmed, because sometimes I don't even have the capacity to like read the titles of these papers, right? But when I do have enough capacity, I read the title, I look at who the authors are, I try to get an idea from the abstract what they're doing, and I just quickly scan. And it's especially important in your own area. For instance, like, I don't know, you can get scooped and it's a terrible thing, right? Or you could not realize that somebody just proved something that you're working on. That's the bad side of things. On the other hand, you might need a tool and you're like, wow, I really don't want to prove this really tedious thing, and someone else did it for you in like one part of their paper. So I think that's probably just one of the most important things when you're trying to place yourself in the spectrum of your small research, field. Yeah, does anybody have any questions about that? Like archive digest, please subscribe. Okay, good. So the second thing is I think it's really important to be able to ask good questions. So this is something that I'll always pick up on if I'm talking to someone about my math, and they ask like the right question. I'm like, man, that's a good listener, right? They were like thinking a little bit ahead. So when I attend talks, and I think it's important for everybody, like try to think about the big picture. The speaker should tell you where the research fits in, what the history is. But if they don't, try to do that yourself, right? And then during the talk, it is nice to think like, okay, if this was my research project, what would my next question be, right? What's the next natural step in this line of research? Because if you practice doing that with other people's research programs, then you will get better at doing it when it's your turn for your own research program to consider the next natural question that you might tackle. So that's more on the finding research projects. That's like training, I think, in some sense, on how to find questions and how to be better at asking questions as you progress in your career. I hear that. I appreciate that Brian actually has their mic off, because I'm like, yeah, it's nice to hear some feedback. Okay, so of course you hear this all the time. I actually didn't attend that many conferences when I was younger in grad school. I don't really know why. I think my advisor just didn't really push me to do that. And I started attending conferences maybe in the middle of my third year, or even my fourth year. But I think it's good to, if you have funding or if you can find funding and apply for funding through every single resource you can possibly find, it's great to attend conferences. So for me, when I started attending conferences, I made friends, right? There's just people that are coming up with you in that generation of mathematicians in your subfield. And it's the best place to make friends, to make mentors, and those people become your future collaborators, right? So for me, we used to have in my research area this big multi-year grant called the GEAR Fund, right? It was like the GEAR so geometric something representations. Anyway, so we used to have retreats, summer retreats that were like 2 weeks long or like a week and a half long. And that was grueling, right? It was a lot of time to just be absorbing math, but we had like a break in between and we'd all be staying at like a dorm, for instance, right? And that the big one that I went to was at the University of Michigan. And I really met so many of my math friends through that one conference. And so many of those people introduced me to other people, and those people became my collaborators. So I have tended to work with other young folks in my field. And that's actually what I wrote down in the next slide as something that's worked for me. But also, and this is not everybody's personality, but if you know there's somebody who you could see as a mentor, maybe you saw them give a talk or you've heard about them on Twitter and they're at a conference, try to create an opportunity to go say hi. I have literally walked up to people in the middle of a conference and be like, hey, I'm going to give an example. I know you're Kasra Rafi. I'm Priyam. I'm a student of Feng Luo's. Like, I've seen this part of your work. And then Kasra is like, oh, let's be friends. Come, let's get a beer. And I was like, oh, that was easy, right? And Kasra has become like a mentor for me over the years and definitely picked me up at harder times in my career when I thought I would never get a job. So that's the kind of thing that's very suited to my personality, and everybody's different, right? But you can try to do something that's suited to your personality. Even if you just sit next to them at like a conference dinner and there's like awkward chat, at least you sat next to them and maybe told them your name, right? So I think that that is something that's just kind of invaluable. And I know it's way harder right now, but as we move out of the time when we can only gather online, it's going to be really important, especially since we've all missed some of that time for a couple of years now, not being able to go to conferences in person. So that's my little shtick on attending conferences. It's exhausting sometimes. I personally have travel anxiety and it's much better now. But yeah, I used to be like, oh, another week that I'm not at home, like I'm going to come back. It's going to ruin my routine. But it's really changes your career in a lot of ways because of all the people that you meet. And they are fun, you know? Okay. Does anybody have like questions, comments about conferences?
I was thinking about when I was in grad school and my advisor would drag me to conferences early on in my like tiny little research area. And it was so scary because there were big name famous people that wrote the textbooks that I had that were like there. It was such a good opportunity, like you're saying, to like meet other people that were young and scared like me that we could collaborate about stuff later on.
Totally. And I feel like, you know, those scary people often become less scary like the third or fourth time you meet them and you realize that like they're only celebrities in our little math world. They're just human beings otherwise. And I do want to like just pause for a second and recognize that like attending conferences isn't the same for every member of our community, right? Like a lot of my women of color friends have told me that conferences have been terrible places for them, right? So when I say conferences are fun, it's not fun for everyone. And that might make you not, you know, make you say, I don't really want to go. And that's fine. It's a personal choice in some sense, and it is a professional choice. There are other ways you can make those networks if conferences make you feel incredibly uncomfortable and the people at conferences make you feel incredibly uncomfortable. The best thing you can do is find someone, like Kate was saying, that shares your experience, right? And then you're like, wait, do you feel like this? Oh my gosh, I feel like this too. And that's also happened for me, right? Like meeting other women in my field, other women of color in my field, and being like, this thing that this person said is kind of messed up, right? And like sometimes that's how you become friends, right? You commiserate about the shortcomings of our community, and then you work together to make it better. So just kind of wanted to put that out there. We should all be aware that conferences are not the same for every person. Okay, yes, my last thing is, this is me as a person, be a connector. So often I feel like we as humans are like, oh, I need somebody to introduce me to this person, or I need somebody to introduce me to this person, and we wait for that. But you can also be a connector, right? And like the more people that you start introducing, I know it sounds kind of silly. It's a very like a businessy perspective, which like I don't really condone. But you know, if you are the one that's like, hey, meet my friend or collaborator, so and so, I think you all have some math things in common. You might want to chat, right? All of a sudden, I mean, in some place, you look like an important person because you are connecting folks, right? And then people want to talk to you in the same way and also repay that favor, right? So if I help my friend out and introduce them to somebody that they were kind of telling me a couple of weeks ago, I'm a little scared of this person. If I facilitate that introduction, well, maybe this other person that they don't find scary and I do, they can introduce me to and help me feel comfortable around that person in the future, right? So really what I'm saying here is like, seize the day. So we all have like some sort of contribution, some sort of power. And like, if you know two people, go on and connect them. If you think they're going to be good, just if they want to be introduced, or if you think they're going to make a good math connection from that. So yeah, be active instead of a little more passive.
A couple of years ago, I had a sabbatical coming, and I was talking to a friend at a conference about like what I was thinking about and what my goals were. And he's like, no, don't do that. Just go work with somebody. And he just calls over like the most productive senior member of our field. It says, Keith, can BK come visit you for sabbatical? Just set up my sabbatical for me at a social event at a conference because we were chatting about it, which was awesome.
Yeah, I love those kinds of friends. And I like strive to be that kind of friend, right? Like it just ends up being great because the more connected your network of people is, that means the more connected you are, right, to all those people. So yeah, these are my general tips. It's kind of generic advice, but I feel like, you know, there might be some mathematically younger folks in the audience who like don't get told these things by their advisors, right? And maybe another tip, this is not about finding research projects and collaborations, but you can, you know, your advisor is not going to be able to give you everything in life. No one person can give you everything that you need, right? So one of the best pieces of advice that I received when I was attending an inclusive mentoring workshop for me mentoring other people was, you know, let other people who know more about a certain aspect of the career talk to your students about this topic. And the same goes for me right now. When I'm seeking out mentors, I don't just seek out one person. I have a network of people and I know who the best person is to ask a specific type of question, right? And yeah, so that's just to say, like, let your advising be more than just one person. Okay, so I'm going to move on to like things that have worked for me. And this is something, again, that depends on your personality. I pinpointed these as like, oh yeah, this definitely helped me. So I have here something that's a time-consuming task, which is hosting visitors, right? If you run a seminar or help to run a seminar as a postdoc, which a lot of postdocs do, it's a lot of work, right? You have to organize the speakers and make sure they get in okay, and maybe like pick them up or move them somewhere, whatever. But the best part of this is you invite people and then they invite you. That's the whole point, right? So even if you don't want to do that work and, oh, who am I going to invite? Well, you meet someone at a conference, even if it's another young person, another postdoc, right? Hey, you should come to Utah and give a talk. And then they're like, oh, actually, I'm running the seminar at my place. You should come give a talk. And that's how you increase your invitations to give talks, right? And that is a part, getting invited, especially again, as we go into more in-person times, getting invited to go visit an institution is one of the best ways to, to find research projects and collaborators, which I'll talk about in just a second, why I think that is. So a lot of work, but I think that's also gives a lot of reward for your career, especially when you're young and trying to network a lot. And once you do get invited to give those talks, I think it's kind of important to maximize a visit when you are going to give a talk. So what do I mean by that? You know, again, you don't have to be passive and let someone set up your whole schedule, right? There might not even be someone there that's going to do that for you because people are busy. You can reach out to people and say, hey, I'm coming to Utah to give a talk in this seminar. You know, do you have like 30 minutes to chat at some point? And you know, often as when I was getting invited to go give talks, and, you know, it's obviously less in person now, I would have a host, and that person would sort of be the primary person I was talking a lot of math with. But that again can make those visits can make you very good at asking questions, because you're hearing about, hey, like, what do you work on? Can you tell me a little bit about this paper that you just wrote? And then you're practicing asking questions, right? And that thing again is what leads you to find good research projects, first of all. But yeah, I think with those visits, you do have to be prepared. So if someone tells you, hey, can you tell me a little bit about your research? If that kind of thing is something that typically makes you nervous, practice it before you go. Like get your pitch ready, right? If it's an elevator pitch and it's 3 minutes and someone doesn't want to hear you talk for 10, that's fine. If you're in an office and sitting down with pen and paper, be ready to give like a big picture outline of like your work, right, in a certain area. So visits are like great, and you should think about like preparing for them a little bit. And after you've done a couple, they kind of just start to flow, I feel like, right? Like when you started to visit people and you've been asked a few times, like, hey, what's your research? What are you thinking about these days, right? That starts to flow out naturally. And then the best thing is sometimes I've had a question ready, like, oh, I'm thinking about this thing and I just don't understand this part, or like, what do you think about this? And like my visits with people have actually helped me write better papers, right? Like I once visited my advisor after I had left the nest, and I was like outlining this approach. And he was like, one of his students actually said, well, why do you need this? Like, why do you need to conjugate by this? Like, doesn't the map itself work? And I was like, oh my gosh, that's actually totally true. And so, yeah, that's all to say, take advantage of those visits. So BK, are there things in the chat that are questions or just comments? Because I'm not checking it.
Just comments so far. There's a little bit of discussion, sort of like building on your point about conferences being positive, but also challenging for individuals, and excitement about researchers who actually read out the lemmas so you don't have to keep reproving things.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure there wasn't anything I was missing there, but yeah, so the next one is kind of obvious, but when you are trying to attract people to work with, to you, your excitement should be out there, right? Like, of course, again, this is like playing to my personality very well. That's why I put this on like things that I've worked for Priyam. I tend to get very excited about things. And when I work really hard on every single talk that I've ever given, I will make sure that it's well thought out. I have anticipated the questions that people might ask at the end. I make my slides nice. I'm very organized. And I think it shows. People continue to invite me to give talks because they know I'm going to work really hard to make it accessible and good. And on top of that, when you see someone so excited about their area in math, you kind of want to like work with them, right? You want to be a part of that excitement, and you want someone to help you feel like that about math if you're in a slump, for instance, right? Which is also very normal. And I've had to give a lot of talks when I'm in a slump and don't really feel great about my research. But I think this one is something that, again, like those of us who are on Twitter, like see this coming up over and over, that people are like, oh, here are my slides. And some of the things that younger folks than me that are coming up with these days, I'm like, you're just an artist. Like, you're not just a mathematician. This is gorgeous, right? So just work hard. It doesn't have to be the most, don't go overboard, right? You have to still do your research and teaching and all the other things, but make sure it's well thought out at the very least. And this kind of brings me, I mean, it does lead directly into the next point, which is, when you're looking for research projects and collaborations, it is important. And this is like, as a very risk averse person, I would have like scoffed at this a little bit ago, but it is important to take chances. So I sort of mentioned this in the abstract as like, the single best decision that I have made in my entire career thus far is to start working in an area that wasn't really developed and it wasn't popular at the time I started working in it. So there was a blog post by Danny Caligari on infinite type surfaces and their mapping class groups, which now everybody's like, oh yeah, it's so trendy. It's like a fun place to be now. But when my first collaborator in this area is Nick Flamis, who's at CUNY, he came to visit me when I was a postdoc at Purdue and said, hey, like I read this blog post and there's this one paper by Juliette Bavard and like, this might become nothing, but I think it's kind of interesting. Like, do you want to think about this with me? And I said, yes. And I can remember where I was when I said yes, because it's completely changed my life to work in this area. So, you know, it comes with its challenges. Like the fact that I started working in that area when no one knew much of anything about it means we were trying to answer some extremely basic questions and reframe our minds in this new setting. And it was just really, really hard. Like we could not figure out some really basic things, but it ended up being a paper, one that I'm pretty proud of, even though, again, because it was a super new field, it didn't go into the fanciest journal, right? Because people didn't really know, well, why the heck should I care about this? But the real turning point for me was when I started giving talks on the topic. And again, I was excited. And all of a sudden, you know, a few senior people start trickling into the field. And then a bunch of younger folks, like a lot of grad students and postdocs were like, wait a minute, this is like a field that's just ripe with questions. And since then, it's really just exploded. It's become so much bigger than I think I could have ever imagined it to be. The questions have become so interesting and there's so much rich structure that, again, I could have never guessed that it would have turned out this way. But I think that that was just a very big turning point in my career. And I took that chance and said, this is something new. I don't really have all the background in this. Surprisingly, I wasn't trained in mapping class groups. I was trained in a lot of hyperbolic geometry and finite covering spaces, but I never went through the basics. So I was learning that stuff while I was trying to prove theorems about it, right? And then also, as the momentum was starting to build, I was invited to organize an AIM workshop on this topic. And we were very strategic. So the four of us that organized it said, well, yeah, there's definitely some senior people and lots of junior people that we're just going to invite because they've come in at the ground floor with us. But also let's pull in some of these other fancy senior people and get them excited about this field. And again, they did, and they started writing papers in this area, right? So inevitably, with all of their experience, they have pushed the field farther than I could have ever imagined. And this is the topic that I wrote my career grant proposal about, right? And that was funded. And so I think it's just like cascaded into accelerating my career in a direction that I really never thought I was capable of. So take a chance once in a while, right? It wasn't a huge risk because the worst thing that could have happened was that I work on this paper and we write down some things and no one cares, right? But it's still a paper, it's going to go into a decent journal. It's not like I was working on the hardest problem in like number theory and then I just had nothing to show for it, right? It was a calculated risk and one that I definitely don't regret. So I know that there are some people in the audience who like do think about infinite type surfaces and like, this is what happened. This is my story in there. And yeah, for someone, again, who's risk averse, it was kind of surprising to me looking back that I was like, yeah, I'll do this. Like, why not? Right. But it's that kind of thing that you try to retain. Like you want to try to be excited about new math all the time. Sometimes you're not because life is hard. Right. But in that moment, it was just perfect. Like I was excited. I was like, let's do it. I have the capacity to learn something new. And I did. So yeah, that's the long version of that very tiny bullet point. Probably a little bit too much information, but that's okay. Okay, so I like working with young people. And I don't mean age, I mean mathematically young folks, right? So people at the same career stage as me. That means that like a lot of us are grasping in the dark, right? We're just like, I don't know what the heck this is. But it's something that I've just loved. A lot of my biggest collaborators are also really close friends of mine, which is not true for everybody, right? And this is why I love going to conferences, because especially my women friends, like the ones that I collaborate with, I get really close to them. We're at the same conferences over and over. It's just like a really great feeling. And I actually just recently was a part of this Women in Geometry Groups and Dynamics workshop. And we put in a proposal, Carolyn Abbott and I, and we like gathered our like favorite young people, and we ended up proving something and writing a paper about it. And it was just like, we were in Montana for a week with no internet, no cell service, and just like wrote our paper. And that, again, I can't believe how much fun that was. It was just like the best feeling ever. So that's something that's worked for me. Another thing I think that kind of plays into why I put this bullet point here is that I think it's good if you have worked with senior people, totally great. But I think it is good to vary that, because I have heard the criticism now being on the other side of hiring and things like that. When you write all your papers with senior people or your advisor, you know, it's a question of like, what do you look like independently as a mathematician, right? So that question has not really come up as much for me because I work with a bunch of random young people, right? So that's just something that I feel like actually was good for me. And this is going to come up on the next slide, but part of the reason I tend to gravitate towards other mathematically young folks is because I get intimidated and I like being able to just ask every question under the sun. And I feel way more comfortable asking other young people about that.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is it like the dynamics when you're working where there's like fewer egos, it's okay to ask questions, there's no sense that, yeah, is that sort of why you like this kind of collaboration?
Yeah, and actually on the next slide, I have like intimidation, what things that I still struggle with, like intimidation when working with more senior folks. Like it is definitely that, the lack of egos, the lack of hierarchy, which is like such a big thing in our field and is actually like pretty detrimental to progress as well, like the hierarchical version of our system. But for me personally, it's a feeling, right? I feel much more comfortable when I like know that the people around me are not like, oh yeah, Priyam's definitely doesn't understand what's going on and she's lost. Or if they do, they're like, Priyam, do you not understand? Like, we could totally explain it to you. It's just such a nice feeling, right? To be able to say to your friend, like, I really don't know what you're talking about. Can we just like back up 5 steps, right? And that's what it is for me. It's a feeling. I enjoy myself more when I work with younger folks, mathematically younger folks.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. So the next 2 are something that I think is like really important and incredibly difficult to actually implement. I have struggled with implementing the next 2. So when I say like, be honest with yourself and reassess, if you do have a collaboration that doesn't feel great, I think it's pretty important to reflect on what it is that's making you unhappy. Why are you avoiding the project? And then try to change the situation if you're able to, right? That might mean that the choice is don't collaborate with that person in the future, right? And that is something that's a privilege. I get to be a little choosier because I have a lot of projects going at once now, right? And I have more choices. So I don't have to choose to work with somebody who makes me feel less comfortable. But even if you don't have as many choices, I mean, a bad collaboration can really make you not like math and not be happy, even in your like personal life, right? So really you have to be honest and like reflect, I think. And that's more about keeping collaborations and choosing future collaborations than it is the first time, because you might not be able to tell, right? But yeah, don't be afraid to respect yourself and be choosy and just say, no, I don't really need this project right now. For me, I'm like, have serious FOMO. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to say yes to every project. And then I end up like drowning in projects and feel like I'm not doing well on any of them. But, you know, as I'm getting older, I'm trying to be a little bit more mindful of where I spend my time. You know, do I really want to write this paper with my postdocs, or do I really want to write this paper with these grad students, or this one with my friends, whatever it may be, right? And like try to be really honest with yourself in that process. And unapologetically choose yourself, I would say. Does anybody have any questions or comments on that one?
Yeah, the best advice I got in grad school was to find people you work well with. And I had a good friend, and we're still good friends, but we had very different work styles. And so our working together on like homework at the time, like really just sort of stressed us out, and it bled into our friendship the rest of the week. And it was just not the right choice.
Yeah.
And then we acknowledged, we're like, we don't need to. If we have a question we want to talk about for a minute, we can, but let's not make that the default. And then things were great.
Yeah. And like, I definitely find myself, gravitating towards certain types of people with certain types of work styles. I'm like really, really methodical and precise. And that means that I have to work with other people who appreciate that and understand why I'm nitpicking, right? It has to be so tight that like no referee will find a problem. I mean, that's unrealistic, but like as close as possible, right? So yeah, I have a hard time writing papers with people who are more big picture thinkers, and like we need to bridge that gap, and that can be really hard sometimes, right? So maybe that means that you invite somebody else onto a collaboration. So again, for me, knowing a bunch of people and trying to know what they're working on can help you bring together a good group of collaborators that might work really well together, right? So if I'm asked a question and someone's like, hey, do you want to work with me on this project? I say, yes, but also I think we should invite this person on because they have great expertise in this area. And I think they would really lend itself well to the dynamic, right? And then you'll know them really well. And that's how I wrote one of my most recent papers. And we've realized that we're a great trio, and we will continue to write papers together for the foreseeable future, right? So I wanted to.
I did have one more comment about that. So from the perspective of someone who's at a primarily undergraduate institution and the associated teaching load, I only have enough time or bandwidth for maybe 1 or 2 projects at a time. And if they're not with people you enjoy working with, like you don't want your one research collaboration or one research outlet to be a miserable experience. So I think even if you if you don't maybe have to room to be choosy, that's all the more reason to be choosy. You have to make sure that your one avenue is something you actually want to do, or else you end up not doing it otherwise.
Yeah, I definitely have that problem. I will just be like, find every reason under the sun to not work on a project, right? When I feel like internally not great about it for whatever reason. So yeah, it might just be like, hey, this isn't working. I can't work on this anymore, right? Or being selective in the beginning is a really good point. Okay, cool. I have like a last slide before we start like opening the floor up, because I don't want you all to think like I've got this like really figured out. And actually, I'm going to exit this for a second because I can't see my whole slide here and move you all over a little bit. I still have like this huge thing where I get really intimidated working with senior folks. Like, I'm on a project right now with someone who was my postdoc mentor before. I was intimidated by him then. I still feel a little scared, even though we had a whole conversation about the fact that I'm intimidated and that he told me I can ask him anything I want, right? This is one of those projects where I will find reasons to not work on it because I'm so scared. It's totally out of my research area. And I feel like I have this very people-pleasing tendency. And so I feel like I'm failing him every time I show up and I don't have something ready. The funny thing is, every time I go to the meeting, we have a great time and I learn something, right? So it's like this anticipational fear that I have that I'm going to disappoint him. Well, but if I did, he probably wouldn't have asked me to continue working on this project with him. He probably wouldn't seem excited every time we chat about it, right? Like, I think I just like, sometimes I get really in my head and I start to think about the second point, which is that, maybe I've come across this and I've started to like try to reason my way through this. When I was really young, when I was a grad student, even an early postdoc, I was like asking questions every day, left and right, because I'm not supposed to know anything, right? Like, it's fine. It's like, oh yeah, you've only been doing math for this long. Of course you don't know about this. And now I start to have to remind myself that I still don't need to have all the answers. If I've been working in 2 big research areas and I've gone pretty deep into those 2 research areas and can answer tons of questions, well, obviously it's going to be really hard for me to have that same depth in this new project that I've never worked in this area before. And I have this like issue where I start to think that people must expect me to know things, right? And I think this can be really detrimental, and it has been for me, because I get shy, and then the best part of me, which is that I heckle people with questions so that I really deeply understand something, is all of a sudden not there in a project, right? So I think that, like, be kind to the people around you, be kind to your collaborators, and continually, I think vulnerability is really important. Like, that's why I put this here. Like, I'm admitting that I still have these issues. And you also, at the same time, if one of my collaborators is having those kind of issues, I try to be really reassuring and say, look, you don't have to have this all figured out. Like, do you want me to explain this a little bit better? It's more in my area. And just like trying to help people feel comfortable with not knowing things, because it's a huge issue in our field that a lot of people walk around and say, I know all these things. It happens from the youngest of years. We see it in undergrads, we see it in people even younger than that. But like, I want to break that, right? I want to break that sort of typical issue that we have by increasing vulnerability. Like, I don't know things. I don't know what's going on. I feel totally lost, and it's making me feel kind of sad, you know? With my most open collaborations with friends, I can always say that. And I'm trying to remember that I can still say that with more senior people who I know are going to affect my career in certain ways, right? Like, yeah, I just wouldn't judge somebody if they came to me like that. So I have to, you know, assume that other people aren't judging me. And if they are, I probably don't want to work with them again, you know, and that's the choosiness part. So I think this is like two things that I'm still working on quite a lot, in choosing collaborations and in choosing projects, like not avoiding working with somebody who just knows a ton more than me, right? Like, it was fine earlier in my life, but it should still be fine as well.
So I've never collaborated with you on research, but combining this with your self-identification with precision and really detail-oriented, I have a prediction that when it comes to these projects, you're the one who keeps saying, like, you know, exactly what does that mean? What does that mean? And you're like moving the research forward by getting it down to the point where you actually say the thing. And then you're like, oh, we could prove the thing now that we've said it carefully. And so I can see how it feels like something you struggle with, but I can also see how it might be like your superpower as a researcher.
And this is like, BK, you're like totally, this is like a revelation I had not that long ago, maybe in the last year or two, that like, when I am being relied on to be that precision tool, to be the fact checker, to make sure everything is airtight, that is inevitably going to leave me less room on all projects to be the ideas person. So it's not actually like my fault, right? I'm contributing in a direction that is a strong suit of mine. And if I want, for instance, to be the ideas person, then someone else on the collaboration better be as precise as I am, because that gives me the room to do that, right? And yeah, I think what we're seeing is that I self-reflect quite a lot in like my personal life, of course, but also in my professional life. I'm constantly wondering, like, why do I feel this way? Is it me? Am I intimidated? Can I get over myself? Or is it this other person or other people that are making me feel this way? And how am I going to solve that problem? Right. And now every day that's gone by, I've liked research more and more. I was not somebody who thought that I was going to have a job at an R1 institution. Every step of the way, my career goals have changed as I've liked research more and more. And yeah, that takes a lot of like mental undoing of things you think about yourself and things that are put on you from this external system that is inherently oppressing people that are marginalized, right? So yeah, your prediction is 100% correct. Something I had to work really hard to like recognize about myself. I still struggle with the next one, balancing projects, priorities, and like self-care. I get migraines if I work too hard, and it's like really bad. Like, I will just be out for the whole day. So like, my goal is to like not push myself so hard that I'm getting sick, right? And everybody's stress manifests in different ways. So I have to be really, again, this is about being choosy. I have to reflect on what my priorities are, what things I truly care about. And that's the things that are going to get my time and energy in all aspects of my professional life. And this can be really hard because it entails saying no to many, 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 many things. And I have a lot of guilt around that. So I'm still working on that. And I feel like I'm at a much better place than I was when a few years ago. But that's something that's just, I think, hard, right? Like, when you have a few projects going at the same time and your mind is very like used to focusing in really hard on one thing, like juggling all those balls has been like a thing that I've had to train my brain to be able to do, to be able to pivot between projects, for instance. And one of the last things that I still find really difficult is I hate this thing in our subject where like there are certain people who deem certain things important. And in my view, anything that someone wants to work on is important, but like that's not the reality of the world that we live in, right? Like if you're working on something that someone really fancy in your field is working on, chances are that's your work is going to be deemed important. And this is something that's really hard for me sometimes. Like I started working in big mapping class groups because I was like, this is cool, this is fun. And thankfully it became important. But like, obviously I wasn't like fully thinking of that when I started working in that field, right? I hoped it would become important. And I like to think that I did a little bit of a part in making it important, but yeah, it's just like, I don't like that part of the system that certain people with certain identities especially get to choose what's important in math. So, you know, I want to tell you like work on the things that make you excited. But on a realistic side of things, I know that we can't all just do that, right? Like if we want to progress in certain directions and get to certain places, that might be our goals, right? You do have to kind of look around and say, how do I show people that this is important? Can I make a connection? Can I like give them enough evidence? Like I really had to convince people in the beginning. Like I promise you, these infinite type surfaces, they do matter. They come up in these other contexts. And I promise we will start to see some connections if we like really start to pursue this. And now we're deep enough in it where we're starting to see connections to, you know, three manifolds and foliations of three manifolds. And then also very surprisingly to descriptive set theory. And I can talk about that in another talk, which is more research oriented. So still have a hard time with that one. And the last slide that I have is now I just want to hear what you all think, because I definitely don't know everything. So yeah, this is the part where I'm happy to open the floor to anybody who has something that has worked for them. That is like, how do you find good research projects and collaborations?
This has been wonderful so far. I have one thought that it's something, so I have taught for years a class. It's sort of like an introduction to research for math majors. And the goal is to like to help them imagine what math research is. And one of the things we do is sort of reflect a lot on our research process. And we sort of think about like the sort of phases that we're going through here and also patterns in the kinds of questions we have. Like we watch a Vi Hart video and we like try to write down every question she asks and we try to organize those into groups. And by having like names for the kinds of moves we make, it sort of helps me to like be like, oh, is this the kind of situation where I might try this different kind of question? And I find that very generative in terms of like, when there's something that interests me, but I don't exactly know what I'm going to be asking about it, having names for the types of questions helps me turn that into like a real research-y thing that I could explore.
Yeah, so BK, do you think that's like more reflecting on the research process?
And naming the pieces so we can use them intentionally, yes.
This is so anxiety inducing for me. I'm terrible at spelling, but I'm hoping it's auto-correcting me as I go.
That's good.
Yeah. Cool.
Others. We cannot hear you, Ian. Your mic is on, but
yeah.
We'll come back in a second.
Yeah. No.
Sadly, no.
Oh,
Ooh.
so sad.
Well, somebody else can go. You keep trying, and you can put stuff in the chat if you can't make the audio work. Grant, was that you raising your hand? You had something to add? No.
I love your message, BK, in the chat. Like, it's me, workaholic. But I thought math was apolitical.
Yeah.
I'm gonna just like re-encourage people not to be shy, because I promise you have things that I have not mentioned that were probably just incredible points to make.
I guess another thing I got from a friend was like a research notebook, which I guess I also incorporated in that same class with the students. And she just had this in grad school, she just had this very straightforward thing where she just got a notebook, she put the date on things, she didn't, like, she crossed things out occasionally, but she didn't erase. I think she wrote in pen. And so she could always go back and be like, what was I thinking? What kinds of questions was I wondering about? What have I accomplished? And it was like this font of things that otherwise would have slipped away. And yeah, and the sort of like the mouth ed analog is we often read papers, but it's, you know, then it sort of disappears into the ethos, where when you're constructing a paper, you have to like cite line by line. If you use like a citation system where they can all be in place, you can put tags on them, they can be searchable. You're not like spinning your wheels, recreating the same research moves over and over again. So I'm always impressed with people who sort of do that like breathing. I have to like force myself to do it.
I tried to keep the research notebook like partway through grad school, and I didn't stick with it. I wasn't like disciplined enough to stick with it. And I also think it's a great idea. But one thing I did was I find it really hard when things aren't written down for me to understand stuff. So like I would have meetings with my supervisor and nothing would be written down of what is the next thing I should work on. And I'm like, where do I go? I forgot what it was by then. So I was trying to like make sure that I took time after every meeting to write down like, what did we talk about? What is my next step in the notebook? And I also used it as a way to like try and keep accountability with me doing the research, in that like trying to write something in it every day, which again, did not stick to it. It was a failed endeavor for me that I would love to go back to, but these were like my aspirational ideas that I wish I could do.
Yeah, that's such a good idea. I've definitely had to start taking notes sometimes after meetings, because it's just sometimes was complicated. I just forget. So my terrorist, like horrible story is that I had a research notebook and then I lost it. And I was like, no, it's okay. I like went in a different direction in my research anyway, but I was like kind of scarred by that whole experience. I looked for it like 7 times and I never found it.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Ian, you want to try again?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yay.
Awesome.
Yeah, so I just wanted to like, something that was on the last slide was like balancing self-care with doing research. Finding collaborators who allow you to do that is very important. You know, I've been in a collaboration for like over a year at this point. And like at some point I went on the job market and was having to like defend my dissertation. And now my collaborator is on the job market and will next semester be preparing their dissertation. And so like, we've just been having to like balance like, yeah, I can't meet the next few weeks, I'm too swamped. And, you know, have so many other things to think about that are much more important at the moment. And so like being able to like, just do that with a collaborator, I think is super important.
It's such a good point. I mean, and especially like the wording that you used, Ian, I feel like we do often think of it as like, oh, am I allowed? Are you allowing me to take a break? Which is so like sad actually, because you should be able to take a break anytime you need, and it should never be judged, right? But that's just not really the reality of how people behave with each other. So when you have somebody who understands that, it can be monumental. And you're right, when you are vulnerable and say, I need a break, often that person realizes 2 months later, actually, I need a break now. Is that okay? You know, so yeah. And actually I'm going to add here, like good communication and collaborations is so important. Good communication and especially on expectations, right? Like communication on expectations. Oh, I thought of one too, which is kind of sounding funny because I didn't think of this when I was writing this. But I think something else that's time consuming, but I don't know what I'm doing to the slide. So I'll fix this up after. Okay, there we go. something that's time consuming, but I have found to be extremely generative of good ideas and framing is writing grants, right? So like writing grants or proposals or anything, even if it's just small things like, I don't mean like necessarily an NSF grant, anything that makes you talk about yourself and your research helps you frame it, helps you give better talks, helps you explain it to other people. And it's like so hard because they're so time consuming, but I've always come out better by applying for grants and proposals and doing so frequently. So I don't lose the skills of writing, in between the times that I have to write things. So.
Mhm. Would like public expository things count in that category too?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm trying to keep all of you in my frame while also trying to edit the document. It's so hard. Okay, so this can generate new questions and framings for your research. So BK, what was that? How did you phrase it?
Public expository writing can also be in that category for some people.
For sure. I mean, like being able to explain math at all levels, I think is like incredibly important. And so like I've had to tell someone what topology is that like hasn't taken algebra before, right? And I realized like you can do that actually. You can even say something about like the fundamental group and it's not so scary if you phrase it the right way. So that's practice for making something really difficult feel easier. Like how do you interpret things to make them accessible, right? Anytime you're practicing that, it's going to make you better at, understanding your own research, I think.
And Mauro, do you want to explain your comment?
Yeah, so actually this was advice I heard like when I was a graduate student, that it's sometimes useful. I mean, you can't do it all the time, but it's useful to read papers that are difficult, like by obscurals. I don't know, like for instance, Beach papers in my field. I mean, Beach writes in a really difficult way. And, if you take the time to read them, then, since nobody really wants to read those papers because they're hard, then there's a lot of ideas that are hidden there that few people have seen. So you can find interesting projects. Of course, it takes a lot of time because they're difficult. So you can't do it all the time, but every now and then I think it's useful.
That's an amazing point. Like really, really good. Also, it makes you less scared to read hard papers because I get so like, oh, do I have to spend another hour on a page of this? This is terrible.
It's connected to several of the other things you've said, but for me, it's really important to sort of like know what motivates me. And I get excited about the sort of the collaboration part and the being with people and, having meeting and that sort of social element. And so I just have to plan social time into my schedule. So it's partially the planning of the time. And then it's also partially knowing that that's what I want out of it. And so if I know I have that thing coming, that helps me motivate me to do a little prep work for it. And then I get excited about the thing. And as long as that's part of the regular schedule, then I have a rhythm of doing those things and it works out. And if I don't, then research turns into this thing like, I can spend a few hours by myself thinking about this thing, and then it doesn't get started, doesn't get rolling.
Yeah, it's like, math, unfortunately, it shouldn't feel like a chore, right? It shouldn't just feel like another thing you have to check off the list. And I think sometimes it's going to happen, but when you can try to frame things and make them fun for yourself, it's really nice. And it makes you dive deep sometimes and get into flow, right? Where you're just like, I don't want to stop thinking about this, which is like a great feeling and is harder and harder to find time for as you get older in your career.
I think we might have time for one more. Well, Priyam, what are you working on right now?
Oh yeah, whew, lots of things. Let's see. One thing that I'm super excited about, there's two things one thing I'm intimidated by, one thing I'm super excited about. actually I'm intimidated by both, but there's a big group of the geometry and topology folks at Utah, like literally like 8 of us, that are trying to characterize like when surface homeomorphisms will give rise to hyperbolic 3 manifolds when you create this mapping torus. So when you have a map of the surface to itself that's a homeomorphism, you can take the surface, cross it with an interval, and then glue the surface to itself using the homeomorphism. For finite type surfaces, that 3 manifold is hyperbolic if and only if the homeomorphism is a certain type, if it's pseudo-Nassau. And for infinite type surfaces, we know some things like n-periodic homeomorphisms will give hyperbolic mapping tori, but we're actually trying to give a total list of conditions that can guarantee that the mapping torus is hyperbolic. That's kind of hard. It's definitely different from things I think about all the time. Like it's certainly mapping class related, so that part's great, but the 3 manifold theory can be like really obscure and challenging. So I'm trying to learn that stuff. And then I'm also learning a lot right now about the other Thurston geometries for manifolds. So there are 8 geometries. I usually only think about hyperbolic geometry, but I'm writing this paper with Daryl Cooper, which is the intimidating project. I'll give full disclosure. It's really outside of my area. We're trying to give a combinatorial description for each of the 8 geometries. So you basically are saying you can construct a certain set of building blocks, finite building blocks, that when you put them all together in all different ways that you can, you'll build exactly all of the manifolds with that Thurston geometry. So yeah, again, this is like really different for me. I haven't thought about the other geometries, so I've had to learn a lot for that. Daryl's been very reassuring. And yeah, it's pretty interesting. And also, yeah, sometimes I have no idea what's going on. So those are 2 things. I'm still excited about it though, right? I'm like trying to talk to myself and be like, this is fine. This is fine. You don't understand this. Just keep moving. It's fine. Like the meme of the dog in the burning room. This is fine.
Perfect.
But yeah, those are 2 big things. I have all the small projects going and things I'm thinking about with my postdocs and stuff, but I just finished a huge amount of work. And so I'm trying to give myself a second to say, I pushed really hard at the end of the summer and beginning of the semester to finish up a few projects. I can take a breath and work slower on research right now, right? Because if I don't take that time, it'll never come.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, that's a perfect ending. I'm going to advertise for next week. Take the share. So we had a great talk this week from Priyam Patel. And then next week, we've got proto-pies, when is a pie chart not a pie chart? By
No.
Oh, sorry, not next week.
Is Thanksgiving.
Next talk.
You're off by a week. Yes, the next talk. That's right. That's right.
2 weeks from now.
We have to eat.
Yes, next week is a break. But by Lucy Rycroft-Smith and Darren Macy of University of Cambridge. I think, well, anyways, I hope everyone comes back. It'll be lovely. So can everyone please join me in thanking Priyam for an excellent talk today.
Thanks, everyone. And really happy to see some familiar faces. Timothy, I see you there. Timothy's an old student of mine from Santa Barbara. So
Good.
yeah.